Some, it was the first affection they'd ever known. All were vulnerable, most in children's homes. Easy prey for the sex ring that groomed and then sexually abused them, beat them and sold them into prostitution around the country. Today, police and social workers apologised for missing opportunity after opportunity to save them. Some viewers may find parts of this report by our social affairs editor Jackie Long disturbing.
Were you involved in any sexual activities with any girl knowing they were under 13 years of age?
No comment.
The men defiant till the end, denying everything to police, but today convicted of a litany of appalling crimes against children as young as 11. Rape, arranging child prostitution and trafficking.
Were you aware that the girls that were there were underage?
Did you take any drugs prescribed or otherwise?
6 girls gave evidence, but police believe there are many other victims and many more men who abused them.
She said that that's you. Why would she say that?
That wasn't me.
It all began here in 2004, around the takeaways and late-night shops on the busy Cowley Road in Oxford. The girls, often escaping troubled relationships at home, were looking for fun and grasped at any chance of affection. The men obliged with sweet words and cheap gifts. The beginning was like a honeymoon, said one of the girls. The end was modern-day slavery. The girls were plied with drink and drugs, held captive in hotel rooms and flats, while men from all over the country arrived to buy sex with them.
There was a pack mentality. If one had had it, they would encourage everybody to have it. I was not sure that physically my body could actually take it. I was emotionally and physically exhausted. They just thought that they could do what they wanted with you, so they would just carry on anyway.
The gang would watch over the girls as they were raped, sometimes by more than one man at a time, and they threatened them and their families if they ever said no. Cowley Road is classic student territory, but this trial has exposed a much bleaker side to life here. This is where the men honed in on vulnerable girls, subjecting them to sadistic levels of abuse. They were raped and beaten. The men urinated on them. One of the girls was sexually assaulted with a knife and a baseball bat. This was about sex, but it was also about money and violence, control and humiliation. Detective Superintendent Simon Morton held off retirement so he could lead the case into court.
It's shocking. It's sexual atrocities. It's torture, some of it. You know, in fact, you can't repeat it. You can't put it on television. You can't write it down. The girl's will is not their own. They just corrupt them completely. They start out at sort of 11 or 12, just an ordinary girl, in our case, and by the time they've finished, they're hollow. They're shells of what they should be, and the little girl that was in there is gone.
Despite today's successful conviction, it's clear social services and police failed to do enough soon enough to stop the abuse which spanned 8 years. All 6 girls were known to social services. 5 spent time in residential care. One was recorded missing 126 times in little over a year. A school counsellor told the court 9 out of 10 of the social workers responsible for the individuals were aware of what was going on. So the question for social services: why didn't they do more to tackle the abuse sooner?
Social workers were absolutely devastated by what's happened. They're in this profession because they care about children, they want things to be better for them.
But did they listen to the girls? Do you think, looking at the evidence, did they listen to the girls and did they act on what the girls told them sufficiently?
Well, the independent review will tell us
what
conclusions. I think we have to wait for the future in terms of seeing what comes out of that. What I know thus far is, from talking to our individual social workers, that they were trying their utmost to try and protect these children. We know we didn't stop this quickly enough, and there's nothing we can say that will change that.
The girls were also well known to the police and separately complained about being abused by Asian men on a number of occasions over the years. In November 2006, police received this emergency phone call from a man who'd been staying the night at the Nanford guest house, where the girl known as Girl 3 in court was being held.
What was she screaming, or?
Yeah, she was
I could hear him slapping her, and obviously, you know, it just seemed like it was a bit of messiness going on in there.
These are the pictures taken by police when they arrived that night. The girl told them she'd been repeatedly raped and beaten, but later retracted her statement after pressure from within the gang. Another girl told the court she regularly ran away, turning up at police stations in a state, only to be threatened with arrest for wasting police time.
I had a feeling police knew what was happening to me, but I was a child. I didn't want to admit what was happening to me.
But police didn't just have a feeling. They formally interviewed the girl in 2006.
On several occasions, that young witness, who was 13 or 14 at the time, did report crimes to us. On some occasions she gave statements, on some she didn't. We did try at that time to work with her to bring cases to court, but she was very young.
She was being abused, she was making that quite clear. Was enough done to protect her? Because the problem was the abuse went on and on.
She was listened to, and on one occasion we even took a video statement from her. But I do regret that it took so long to get to trial. And I've said that to the girl you're talking about, and to other girls, and to her parents.
Stay where you are.
They do things differently now. The Kingfisher team, police and social workers patrol at night, offering support to vulnerable girls and actively seeking out men suspected of child sexual exploitation. This man has been on their radar a while. The Crown Prosecution Service is to review 3 cases involving some of the young girls where they initially decided not to prosecute. In the wake of Operation Bullfinch, many things are changing. For the girls, it's just a pity it took so long.
At 7:30, back now to our main report tonight. The conviction of 7 men for the sexual exploitation of girls aged 11 to 15 in Oxford. The victims were subjected to horrific abuse, raped and tortured in a case police have likened to modern-day slavery. This is the latest in a number of cases featuring mainly Pakistani men as the abusers, sparking debate over what role, if any, race, religion and culture play in this type of crime. Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has this.
These are the men who abused girls as young as 11 in the most brutal way. 5 are of Pakistani origin, 2 are North African. Their crimes span 8 years, it's feared, with as many as 50 or 60 victims. Just one case, but the latest in a series which has pushed questions of race, religion and culture to the forefront of the debate. Hanging over this trial, as with others like it, has been the question of what role race has played. Certainly for some of the families of the convicted, it's been key. We've spoken to the fathers of 4 of the men. They didn't want to go on camera, but they insisted their sons were innocent, only targeted by the police because they were Asian, or at least looked it. Manchester, Rochdale, Derby, horrific cases of abuse. The majority of those prosecuted were Pakistani Muslims. Experts argued against drawing any conclusions other than that the men were evil predators. But many see the cases as evidence this type of gang-related exploitation is a problem particular to the Pakistani Muslim communities of Britain. On the streets of Keighley in West Yorkshire, a textbook case of the grim process of grooming.
She said they were just her mates. You know, when I spoke to her about it, she said, oh, they're just my mates. And they were meeting her up by the school and taking her off in the car. And then they'd be going off drinking and smoking and, you know, they were giving her drugs and things like that. And there were times that she'd leave the house at, say, 8 o'clock in the morning and she wouldn't come home till 11 o'clock at night, you know, and she'd be just off her face on drugs.
Angela Sinfield's daughter was groomed and sexually exploited from the age of 12 by a gang of Asian men in West Yorkshire.
They give you the phone, they give you the drugs. But in the future, they want payback for it. And this is how they get you sleeping with a friend, because if you really loved me, you'd do it.
Do you think your daughter and the other girls were targeted because they were white?
Yes, I do. I do. Because, you know, these young Asian males have no respect for Asian women. And, you know, our daughters were just known as white trash. You know, as I was told when I was once looking for my daughter, and I asked a young Asian lad if he'd seen her, And he looked at me and said, oh, all the prostitutes hang out by the bowling green.
The tortured question of ethnicity and child sexual exploitation has been so pressured it's almost impossible to talk about it in terms of hard fact. Statistics are notoriously unreliable in this area, but the headlines loom large. Many within the Pakistani and Muslim community feel because of those headlines they now have no choice but to speak up, forced in a way to account for the crimes of a minority among them, in ways the white community doesn't have to.
And in some ways I feel that grooming is the new terrorism, and that is the new stick to beat a particular community with.
Even among those signed up to this Muslim-led coalition against sexual exploitation in Bradford, there's clear frustration that it's being seen as a crime which belongs to just one community.
Young men today are completely morally ambivalent about this particular issue.
Ilyas Kamani works with young men from many different backgrounds at risk of violent or criminal behaviour. He says abusive attitudes towards women are not unique to any one group of men.
Some Pakistani men do dehumanise and devalue women. But that's interestingly, most sexual abusers do exactly the same thing. When it comes to their victims, they see their victims as worthless. They completely devalue them, dehumanise them, and that's why they have this double standard. They wouldn't abuse someone in their own family, but they would sexually abuse someone else's child because of that dehumanisation process.
He does believe, though, there are specific issues which do need to be addressed.
Where you have a culture where, it's very conservative, where you don't talk about sex, and talking about sex is seen as a real kind of taboo, then what that means is that people then feel very suppressed, and as a result of that, they lead a double life where, they feel that they can't be open about particular behaviour that they're involved in. And that's very dangerous, because what that means is that in that double life space, you're actually much more vulnerable to what we call at-risk behaviour.
Why this? Why now? Why here?
And the woman at the head of the coalition says she believes people within the Pakistani and Muslim communities where previous trials have taken place must have been shielding abusers, and that, she says, has to stop.
It's quite obvious to me that there is an element of that happening. I'm not sure about the men, whether it's women as well, I don't know. I can't understand how the levels of exploitation and absolutely horrific criminal behaviour from men versus these young girls, how can people not know about that? How can people not know that this kind of stuff is happening in a small town? So if people know, why on earth are they not coming forward? So we need to unpick all of that.
There are many more cases yet to come to court. In Bradford alone, there have been 90 arrests of men suspected of exploiting girls in the past 6 months. Police warn against easy assumptions that there is only one type of abuse and one type of abuser. And even Angela, who's convinced her daughter was targeted by Asian men because she was white, agrees.
This, to me, has always been about sexual exploitation. And I live in Keighley. I've lived there all my life. And there was a case in the paper last week where a 48-year-old white man is actually on remand at the moment for molesting a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old girl. But it was a few pages into the paper and a very small column. Like we've seen today, the media is very powerful, but sometimes it's the way that it's done that's wrong.
These trials have put the focus on the Muslim community in Britain. But as police face record numbers of abuse allegations this year, there are questions for many others too.
Well, we're joined in the studio now by the Deputy Children's Commissioner, Sue Berlowitz, who is currently undertaking a 2-year review into child sexual exploitation. And from Leeds, by the Imam and Councillor Ilyas Kamani, who we met in Jackie Long's film. Sue Berlowitz, is it race?
No, as has been said very clearly in that video, that very helpful video that we've just seen, this is an issue of sexual exploitation that is taking place, I'm afraid, unfortunately, across all parts of our communities and in all ethnic groups. I'm halfway through, indeed just over halfway through, a 2-year inquiry, as you mentioned, into sexual exploitation. Spent a whole year investigating prevalence, who's doing what to whom, who are the victims and who are the abusers, and the evidence we have gathered is very clear. People are looking primarily for Asians within the various agencies, the police and other agencies, and then that's what they're finding. But where they broaden their vision to look at more generally at who is hurting children in this absolutely abominable way, they are finding, regrettably, that the reality is there are people abusing children from every part of our community.
That's extremely interesting, Alias Kamani, because what it suggests is the reason that we're seeing Asians in particular arraigned in these cases is because they are the people that are being targeted by law enforcement rather than across the board, all races.
Well, in our work with young men across the whole of society, we found that, you know, this is a form of behaviour that we've seen in all sections of British society. And I think when we fixate on Pakistani men and we over-present the cases regarding Pakistani men, what we're actually doing is a disservice in terms of protecting children who are vulnerable to sexual exploitation. And that's why it's important to recognise there are many, many models of sexual exploitation of children in British society. Yes, there is a problem.
Can I just pause you there and in a sense take advantage of your position, which is a great knowledge, obviously, of the Asian community in particular. Is there anything about the culture, which in some way, and after all, two of these defenders were actually from North Africa, but is there anything about the culture which might explain this awful behaviour?
Well, our experience is that there is nothing unique to Pakistani men which kind of disposes them towards sexual violence. The factors are the same as any other group of men. It's impunity, that they operate without being challenged. There's a wall of silence, obviously. People are aware of what goes on, and they don't challenge that behaviour. There's sometimes this entitlement as well, that men think that they can, and they're allowed to commit these acts of sexual violence. And what we go as far as to say is that we think there's a global epidemic in terms of sexual violence. We think there's a profound problem with masculinity in society, that men think it's all right and acceptable to perpetrate this horrendous violence and abuse against women. And we actually related it.
Let me take that up then with the Children's Commissioner, because that's a very, very interesting point, that in fact there's a kind of deterioration in masculinity, which perhaps has happened as a result of the empowerment of women, which leaves this potential growth in this appalling activity.
Well, I don't think it's possible for anybody to say it's worse today than it was in previous years. What is different now is that we have a much better idea of the extent of what's going on, which simply was not known before.
Let me just press you on the question of gangs then, because this was a gang, and there have been other gangs in Manchester, in Rochdale and Derby, and yet the white perpetrators seem to act not necessarily together as a gang, but individually, but collectively, of course, they represent the same threat.
Well, I think that's not quite accurate. You know, there are examples. There's one in Derby, for example, where most of the people who were convicted of sexually exploiting very young children in that case were actually white.
And they operated as a mob.
And they operated as a group. The modus operandi was exactly the same. In fact, we would call this group-based sexual exploitation. We have a different definition of gang that I won't go into now. The main common denominator between all those people who sexually assault children in this particular way is that they are male, which is not the same as saying that all men are abusers. It's a very different statement.
Alias Kamani, then, how does law enforcement, how do people, social workers and the others, reach out both to the victims and most particularly to the perpetrators and crack this?
Well, I think we have to become much more proactive and preventative. I think there's a massive project in terms of education in schools. What we're doing is we're profoundly failing in terms of really inculcating those basic human rights about valuing women, especially in terms of men. And I think sex and relationship education is really radically failing in terms of really, challenging some of these attitudes that we see legitimate violence against women. But I also think there's a real problem in terms of the police and social services. They can't actually operate in the spaces where CSE is taking place. It takes place 24/7. It takes place in ungoverned spaces. And a lot of the statutory agencies are actually risk averse or actually prevented from going into those spaces at those particular times. And if they do, all they do is disrupt activity to other spaces. And I think really good, effective youth work and outreach work on the streets is really the most effective way to support a lot of young people. And unfortunately, because of the cuts, a lot of that work is being stopped at the moment.
Alias Kamani and indeed Sue Berlowitz, thank you both very much. We need so much more on this, but there it is. Well, now, in a moment, we'll talk to the Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer. But first, we're joined by Nicola Blackwood. She sits on Parliament's Home Affairs Committee. She's the MP for Oxford West and Abingdon, the area where some of the abuse took place. Nicola Blackwood, why do you think that the investigation, which took nearly 8 years, and of course these were children who became women and suffered in all that time. Why do you think it took so long?
Well, firstly, I'd just like to say that I think that we should be very pleased that justice has come at last tonight, and we should pay tribute to the girls for their bravery in going through that process of the investigation and the court case, because you cannot underestimate the bravery in giving evidence in court. But we are right to question why this serious and widespread abuse has been going on for so long. It started as far back as 2004. And over the course of the last 18 months, I first found out in March 2012. I've asked police officers and social workers and charity workers and experts of all kinds why this happens, why nobody finds out. And what I've heard is victims don't think they're victims in the first place, and those who are supposed to help them come up with the attitude, well, if they can't help themselves, we can't help them.
Yeah, but you see, you also have this instance in which one of them did make a serious complaint to the police and was nearly arrested herself for wasting police time. So the kind of mindset isn't there ready to accept that they may well be victims.
And in those cases, often you come up against another form of ignorance, which is that these are just bad girls making life choices, because a lot of the abuse results in the kind of behaviour that you would consider to be just naughty girl behaviour, sort of drug and alcohol abuse, truancy, unexplained injuries, STDs and unwanted pregnancies, and often that kind of behaviour masks the vulnerability of these victims. Now, thankfully, CEOP, the CPS and the College of Policing are identifying these as indicators of this kind of grooming, but that is only a recent understanding, and that is why it has taken so long to start prosecuting these kinds of cases.
This is not the whole story. I mean, there are other men who were not prosecuted because they couldn't get enough evidence, and many other victims.
Well, I do believe that this is the beginning of the fight to get rid of this crime in Oxford, but also in other places up and down the country.
Nicola Blackwood, thank you very much indeed for talking with us. Keir Starmer, there has been a very long delay in getting this to court. Indeed, justice has been done, but we know that the gang was very much bigger than this, and that there may have been up to 50 victims.
Yes. I mean, I think what this case demonstrates that these sorts of issues can be properly investigated and properly prosecuted, and we have to pay tribute to the teams that brought the cases to court and to the victims that did come forward. But
we have to qualify that by saying that some tremendously strong signals were missed.
We have to qualify that by saying there's good work now, but there hasn't been historically, and things have to change. And for me, there has to be a sea change in the way that we approach credibility in these cases. These victims were very vulnerable. They were picked on because they're vulnerable, and when they came forward, those vulnerabilities were identified by police and prosecutors, the very reason that the cases couldn't be brought forward. We need to change that. We've done a lot of good work in recent months and years to change that, but we've got to complete on that part of our work. It's very important that we assess vulnerability properly and accept that many of these victims are not going to come forward and give a coherent and full account first time. Very often they'll go back to the perpetrators. They may well use drink and drugs, but that's not a reason not to prosecute. That's a reason to prosecute, but to build a case.
In accepting that things didn't go well in the beginning and that things have changed, both police and social services have apologised for their role in this. What about the law? Do you have an apology to make?
Well, I don't think from a prosecutorial point of view, it's about apologies. We've just succeeded in bringing this case. The best thing I can do is to try and ensure that the police and prosecutors going forward approach this in the right way. We've been hard at that for the last 6 months, working on guidance that will bring forward a new approach and making sure that other government departments are involved in this, that the court environment is involved in this. So my role really is to ensure that we learn the lessons, we build on the successes of cases like this, and we make sure that going forward this just doesn't happen again.
But we're talking in a period of austerity when your department, when all sorts of other aspects of law enforcement are under siege. Is priority now going to be given to these sort of cases? Because there are so many of them. I mean, there are 90 people on remand in one area of the country involved in this sort of stuff. There are other cases in other parts of the country. I mean, do the resources exist to really cut this cancer out?
I think it's very important to be clear, resources were not the problem in the past. It was the mindset. And I don't think resources is the problem going forward. Our most important task is to make sure the police and prosecutors approach this with the right mindset and assessing vulnerability properly. If we're going to achieve that, I don't have so many concerns about resources.
When people talk about various crimes being down, like robbery and burglary or whatever, what about these kind of offences? Is there something here that we should be very alarmed by? Because we have had these huge cases in Manchester, in Rochdale, in Derby. We know other cases are pending. Is this an epidemic?
I think this is something to be very concerned about. I think there are a number of cases that are already coming through. There are other cases that we are looking at and will hope to bring. And I think we have to face up to the prospect that there are other victims who have not yet found the confidence to come forward. So this is not a problem that's going to go away. It's a problem which is going to grow. I hope, in a sense, there are more cases, because I hope victims will have more confidence. And that's a good thing.
Well, I mean, Savile has led to people coming forward in that regard. You would urge vulnerable young people, even if they're not, well, let's hope they are watching here, but that they should come forward.
I would urge victims to come forward. I think it's very important to help us build cases. If we have more than one victim alleging against one perpetrator, that hugely helps us. Our job is to create the environment in which they feel safe coming forward. That's our task, and we've got to get on with that.
Keir Starmer, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Kathy?
Have it. I was not sure that physically my body could actually take it. I was emotionally and physically exhausted. They just thought that they could do what they wanted with you, so they would just carry on anyway.
The gang would watch over the girls as they were raped, sometimes by more than one man at a time, and they threatened them and their families if they ever said no. Cowley Road is classic student territory, but this trial has exposed a much bleaker side to life here. This is where the men honed in on vulnerable girls, subjecting them to sadistic levels of abuse. They were raped and beaten. The men urinated on them. One of the girls was sexually assaulted with a knife and a baseball bat. This was about sex, but it was also about money and violence, control and humiliation. Abuse which spanned 8 years. All 6 girls were known to social services. 5 spent time in residential care. One was recorded missing 126 times in little over a year. A school counsellor told the court 9 out of 10 of the social workers responsible for the individuals were aware of what was going on. So the question for social services, why didn't they do more to tackle the abuse sooner?
Social workers were absolutely devastated by what's happened. They're in this profession because they care about children, they want things to be better for them.
But did they listen to the girls? Do you think, looking at the evidence, did they listen to the girls and did they act on what the girls told them sufficiently?
Well, the independent review will tell.
It was the first affection they'd ever known. All were vulnerable, most in children's homes. Easy prey for the sex ring that groomed and then sexually abused them, beat them and sold them into prostitution around the country. Today, police and social workers apologised for missing opportunity after opportunity to save them. Some viewers may find parts of this report by our social affairs editor Jackie Long disturbing.
Were you involved in any sexual activities with any girl knowing they were under 13 years of age?
No comment.
The men defiant till the end, denying everything to police, but today convicted of a litany of appalling crimes against children as young as 11. Rape, arranging child prostitution and trafficking.
Were you aware that the girls that were there were underage?
Did you take any drugs prescribed or otherwise?
6 girls gave evidence, but police believe there are many other victims and many more men who abused them.
She said that that's you. Why would she say that?
That wasn't me.
It all began here in 2004, around the takeaways and late-night shops on the busy Cowley Road in Oxford. The girls, often escaping troubled relationships at home, were looking for fun and grasped at any chance of affection. The men obliged with sweet words and cheap gifts. The beginning was like a honeymoon, said one of the girls. The end was modern-day slavery. The girls were plied with drink and drugs, held captive in hotel rooms and flats, while men from all over the country arrived to buy sex with them.
There was a pack mentality. If one had had it, they would encourage everybody to have it.
Detective Superintendent Simon Morton held off retirement so he could lead the case into court.
It's shocking. It's sexual atrocities. It's torture. Some of it. You know that. In fact, you can't repeat it. You can't put it on television. You can't write it down. The girl's will is not their own. They just corrupt them completely. They start out at sort of 11 or 12, just an ordinary girl, in our case, and by the time they've finished, they're hollow. They're shells of what they should be, and the little girl that was in there is gone.
Despite today's successful conviction, it's clear social services and police failed to do enough soon enough to stop the